Admiral Savitur did not watch the battle. He watched the numbers, sensor data, distance markers, the energy output of the human ship, and structural integrity assessments that his system updated every 4 seconds. He stood in the center of the command bridge of the Red Solo, the largest warship ever launched by the Hegemony, watching columns of data scroll across a pale blue screen, feeling nothing in particular. 37 ships against 1. This was not a battle. Savitur had been in battles. Battles have weight. A battle is when two sides press against one another like stone against stone, each trying to find a fracture in the other. This was not that. This was a materialized notification. The Hegemony had thrice ordered the human ship to vacate the disputed corridor near the Velaretz system. The human ship had responded with what its crew apparently called Standard Challenge Protocol, which translated to, "We are here requesting you to identify yourself and state your intentions." It had seemed almost interesting to Savitur the first time he read it. Humans wanted to discuss intentions as if intentions were a variable, as if what something meant mattered, rather than what it did. What the Hegemony did was send 37 ships. The human ship, according to his intelligence dossier, was the UNSC Unrelenting, a long-range destroyer-class vessel. Its crew of 847, 4 years away from scheduled decommissioning, reacted to the arrival of 37 warships as a cornered animal might. It moved. It opened fire. Its weapons were not nothing. 3 of his ships sustained damage that would require attention at the next port. One of his officers would need a prosthetic arm, which would take 6 weeks and be unpleasant. That was the extent of the damage the Unrelenting inflicted. The battle lasted 11 minutes. The wreckage stopped glowing after 6 hours. Savitur watched the final heat signature vanish from his screen. He opened the destruction report template on his second console. He filled in the fields: vessel designation, estimated crew count, time of engagement, outcome. He saved it under the category Status Enforcement of Disputed Corridor, which he had used 43 times before. He added the Unrelenting to the list. He saved the file. Then, he dictated a brief status message for the Hegemony's diplomatic channel and transmitted it on the standard frequency the humans monitored. The message confirmed the removal of the vessel from the corridor and invited the human government to respond via official channels. If they wished to discuss the corridor's status in the future, he was generous. It was a word his culture used: generosity. To give the defeated side the opportunity to speak, to formally offer a path to submission rather than simply assuming it. He went to sleep. Yara Ose had been awake for 19 hours when the signal went dark. She sat at her console at listening post Delta. 7, 4 people, 1 ship the size of a transit bus parked at the edge of the Velaretz system behind a rock formation that masked sensors, a formation the Hegemony either hadn't discovered or hadn't bothered to remove. She watched the last trace of the Unrelenting fade from her screen. The debris field was still visible on passive scans. It would be visible for a long time. Some of the pieces were large. She sat with it for a while. No one at the post said anything. Yara could hear the breathing of technician Brass behind her, slightly louder than usual. That is how people breathe when they are trying to control themselves. She heard the background hum of the post's life support. She heard her coffee cooling in the mug near her left hand. 847 people. She knew 4 of them, not well just the way people in this branch of service know each other. Names, faces, one shared meal, perhaps a mutual understanding that they were all very far from anything that mattered. She knew Petty Officer Declan Rowe from the transfer station and remembered he talked too much about a band no one else knew, and she had pretended to be interested because it was a 16-hour transfer and she had nothing else to do. She did not think about Declan Rowe now. She opened the transmission log. She composed an urgent message to the Earth Relay Unified Space Command. She attached the full sensor log of the engagement all 11 minutes, the debris field data, the Red Fleet composition, and the status message from Savitur that her system had intercepted and translated. She read the translation twice. Admiral Savitur had invited humanity to respond through official channels. Yara typed her note at the bottom of the report. Including personal notes was not standard protocol. She included it anyway. It read, Admiral Savitur filed his destruction report before the heat signatures had even vanished. I watched him do it via the intercepted command channel. He filed it the way one files a delivery receipt for cargo. I want command to know that. She sent the report. Then she leaned back and looked at her hands. They weren't shaking. She thought they should be shaking. She thought about why they weren't, and realized it was because she had passed the part of this that felt like grief about 40 minutes ago, when the last large piece of the Unrelenting broke apart on passive scan and she realized that none of this would ever be okay. She had used up the shaking. Somewhere else, something else was sitting very still. Brass came up behind her and placed a hand on her shoulder. She let him. She stared at the coordinates of the debris field on her screen. The field was drifting. In a few years, the debris would scatter along the corridor, and in 100 years, it would be impossible to know a ship had been there. Just metal, just iron and composites, and those specific alloys humans used in their fourth-generation hulls, floating in the dark like everything else eventually floats in the dark. 847. She opened the crew manifest. She hadn't looked at it before. Now she did. She scrolled slowly. Most of the names she didn't recognize. She recognized 4. She stopped on Declan Rowe, Petty Officer 2nd Class, 29 years old, from a town in Western Ireland she had never heard of and would now never visit. She closed the list. She didn't open it again. The Hegemony diplomatic channel waited for a response from the humans. It was calibrated for expectations. It had waited for responses from 43 civilizations over the last 3 centuries. Most responded within 1 or 2 cycles. The fastest responded in 4 hours. A species called the Sulithva, small, purple, and extremely anxious about everything, who transmitted an official apology, a territorial concession, and a gift of significant cultural value before the first Hegemony warship had even left the outer rim of their home system. The Red did not hate the Sulithva. The channel waited. Day 1 passed. The channel recorded no response. Standard protocol. Continue monitoring. Day 3. No response. Day 7. The Hegemony Xenopsychology Department prepared their first assessment. It was a short document, confident in its conclusions. Humans were in a grief phase. Their species bonded in unusually strong clusters. Family, crew, national, and mass casualties created destabilizing ruptures in these clusters. The species required time to process the loss before it could engage in rational diplomatic exchange. It was well documented in Hegemony files. 3 other species had shown similar delays in post-correction reactions. Expected response period: 30 to 60 cycles. The diplomatic channel remained open. The Hegemony Trade Department quietly adjusted the tariff structure on goods moving through the corridor. The disputed zone was reclassified as Hegemony administered. The documentation was processed per standard protocol for territorial acquisition, a category that did not require external confirmation to become legally binding under Hegemony law. It was tidy. Salvatore filed a commendation report for 3 of his tactical officers and moved on to other assignments. Assignments were always there. The message, when it finally came, arrived on day 12. Not from the human government, not from their military command. It came from a civilian scientist at a university on the human's home planet, a professor of xenolinguistics named Dr. Alias Stern, who had apparently been hired to verify the translation. She sent a single message requesting confirmation that the Hegemony's original notification, a 9-page document transmitted to the Unrelenting before its destruction, had been correctly received and displayed in the standard human language. The Hegemony Diplomatic Department confirmed it had been. Dr. Stern thanked them and terminated the transmission. The Diplomatic Department recorded this as an administrative clarification and filed it accordingly. No one noted it. The listening post received a supply drone on day 15. Yara helped unload it. Mostly food. Mostly dense, brick-shaped rations that tasted like cardboard but kept you alive, which was an important metric so far out. There were also new datasets, 3 spare parts for the sensor array, and a sealed communications packet addressed personally to Yara from her immediate superior at Unified Space Command. She opened it in private. It read, "Your personal note has been received. It has been passed to the appropriate parties. No further action is required on your part. The appropriate party." She folded the message, put it in her jacket pocket, and returned to unloading the drone. Brass asked if she was okay. She said, yes. She wasn't entirely lying. She just didn't have a better word for what things were. On day 19, the sensor array caught something strange. Not a ship, not a weapons signature. Something Yara had to look at 3 times before she was sure she was reading it correctly. A mathematical transmission, a narrow beam directed not at a populated system, but at a stretch of open space on the far side of the corridor. Simple sequences, A signal a species sends when it wants to prove it exists. We are here. We are ordered. We are sentient. A signal humanity had sent into deep space a long time ago, before they had found anyone to send it to. Yara ran a trace on the origin. It came from Earth. She logged it and sent it up the chain. She noted that the target coordinates were not populated, not strategically significant, nothing, just space. She returned to her watch. She told herself it was a test, an equipment calibration, something like that. She didn't entirely believe herself. The red relay was still waiting on day 22. The xenopsychology department updated its assessment. The grief phase was lasting longer than predicted. It was unusual, but not unprecedented. A third species in comparison, a bird-like civilization that the hegemony had corrected near the outer rims about 80 years ago, had reacted in 21 cycles. Humans were approaching that record. Updated recommendation: continue waiting. Increase diplomatic monitoring. Do not adjust the territory reclassification timeline. The second recommendation was written by a junior analyst named Vetari, presented as an addendum to the main document, formatted in the smaller font the department used for dissenting or minority opinions. It read, "I want to note for the record that the delay in human response might not be related to grief. Lack of communication does not equal lack of action. Our monitoring of human internal channels is limited. We are looking at the door and assuming nothing is happening behind it." Vetari's supervisor read it, noted it, but did not include it in the summary document sent to the Hegemony High Council. The next morning, he transferred Vetari to cartography. It wasn't a punishment. Officially, it was resource reallocation. Vetari was told his skills were needed in the cartography department. He packed his things. He didn't argue. By nature, he was a man who wrote addenda, not arguments. He took his personal data tablet with him. He kept working on his own. Yara was on the third watch of a 3-6-hour schedule when the second mathematical transmission sounded. Same format, different coordinates, still directed at nowhere. A dead zone on the outer rim of the Velaret's corridor. No stars, no debris, no landmark. She straightened up. She opened the coordinates of the first transmission and laid them next to the second. She stared at the 2 points in space for a long time. She opened the system star map and its surroundings, a map showing all recorded red holdings within a 4-light-year radius. She plotted the 2 coordinate points. Then she sat very quietly for about 40 seconds. She thought about Declan Rowe. She thought about the debris field that was drifting now, which was just debris in the dark. She thought about the destruction report filed before the heat signatures had even vanished. She deleted the coordinates from her personal screen. She would not hand them to the red intercept teams on a silver platter. The Hegemony channel was still open when day 40 arrived. It had been open longer than any previous post-correction reaction period in recorded Hegemony history. The xenopsychology department stopped issuing time estimates. Salvatore received a request from his command asking if he thought a second notification was necessary. He drafted a response recommending patience. Humans were a young civilization. They had limited military resources. They had lost 1 ship. Painful, yes, but not the end of a civilization. They would come to the negotiating table. All species did. He sent the response and returned to his other work. That night, if night is the right word for the dark cycle on a warship that never truly slept, he reviewed the unrelenting sensor log once more. He had done this several times, though he couldn't say why. He watched the 11 minutes. He watched the human ship move sharply, aggressively, devotedly, firing everything it had into the face of 37 warships, with the specific focus of someone who understood they would lose and simply decided that the understanding was no reason to stop. He closed the file. He didn't write anything about his thoughts. He wasn't sure his thoughts had a category. Day 41. The answer came. The Hegemony Diplomatic Department received a transmission from the Unified Space Command, Earth. Standard format. Correct authentication codes, timestamp, and relay station log 614. The duty officer opened it, expecting a formal structure of protest. There were templates for this, established forms that civilizations used when they wanted to register objections to military correction. He expected references to casualties. He expected language about territorial rights, treaty violations, deep space navigation, the value of human life. He honestly expected a number. A number was always the start of negotiations. He read the transmission. He read it again. He checked the authentication 3 times. The transmission consisted of 2 sentences. The first sentence was the reference number, the Hegemony's own 9-page notification filed before the destruction of the Unrelenting, cross-referenced with its official document identifier. The second sentence was, "Received and acknowledged." Nothing more. The duty officer stared at his screen. He called his superior. His superior read it. He called his superior. Salvatore was woken at 3:40 a.m. by an urgent call. He sat at his console, sleep still weighing heavily on his joints, and read the two sentences on his screen, "Received and acknowledged." He sat there for a long time. Outside the viewports of the Red Solo, the corridor drifted, silent and cold. The reclassified territory was still where it had always been. The destruction report had been filed. The documentation was clean. Everything was in order. Received and acknowledged. He read it a third time. Then he did something he hadn't done since the beginning of his career. Before 43 corrections had made him very confident in how things went. He wasn't sure. He opened the intelligence file on humanity. He read it from the first page. Their history, their wars, and there were many. Huge ones. The kind that leave traces in a civilization's psychology for centuries. Their technological trajectory, their current military power, which was estimated as limited, below the threshold of a significant threat. He read the note on their internal psychology. Bonding. Grief. He thought about the silence, not the silence of grief. The silence of what? Something that had already decided. He typed one message to his intelligence chief and sent it before he could think too much. "Is this the right move?" it said. "What are they building?" The answer came 3 hours later. It said, "We have no clear visibility. Our monitoring of their internal production channels is limited. Increased power output is observed from several off-world installations, but the signature profiles are inconclusive. Assessment continues." Salvatore read it. Assessment continues. He looked at the corridor on his navigation screen. He looked at the coordinates of the debris field, still logged in his system since the first day. Now just ghost data, pointing to empty space. He thought about the Unrelenting, about how it had moved, how it kept firing, about that specific quality of a being that had decided. He opened the destruction report once more. He looked at the category under which he had saved it. Status enforcement of disputed corridor. He stared at it for a very long time. He did not change it. He would change it later. He would find, when later arrived, that there was no category in the system that fit. He would have to create one. He would call it miscalculation, but that was later. Now, on day 41, with 2 sentences on the screen and a cold silence on the diplomatic channel that should have been full of noise but wasn't, he sat in the darkness of his command ship and felt something he hadn't felt in 43 corrections. He felt the ground shift. Not under his feet there were no feet. It was something ancient, something in the part that, before becoming an admiral, before becoming a soldier, before becoming the thing the hegemony had molded him into, was just an animal. And the animal said, "Something is wrong." He did not sleep again that night. 40 light-years away, on a planet that would soon become the quietest, most bustling place in the known galaxy, 61 warships were almost ready. The first thing they did was go quiet, not the silence of grief, not the silence of shock. The Hegemony Xenopsychology Department had cataloged both of those. The silence of grief had a shape. You could see it in communication patterns, a burst of internal transmissions between bonded units, the way the species turned inward and talked to itself more than usual when it was hurting. Shocked silence looked different, more like static, like a system trying to reboot. This was neither. This was the silence of a closing door. The Hegemony monitoring team spent the first week recording the absence of things. No official protest filed with the Interstellar Commercial Relay, no emergency session convened at the Neutral Territory Diplomatic Station near the Ketwara Crossroads. No public statements from human government leadership. Human news channels covered the story of the Unrelenting crew count, 11 minutes. And then the human government said nothing. And after a few days, the monitoring team noted that the news channels had gone quiet too. Not entirely, but quieter, as if something had been decided. And everyone who lived inside that decision agreed, without meetings, without voting, that there was no point in speaking loudly about it. The Hegemony's chief diplomatic analyst, a cautious woman named Sveta Aura, wrote in her Day 7 summary, "The silence of the human government is not an absence of interaction. It is a form of interaction. We must treat this as communication." Her boss read it and wrote back, "Speculative. Revised to reflect only observable data." She revised it. She kept the original in her personal file. On Titan, the third shift didn't go home. It wasn't an order. It was a memo, 3 paragraphs. Dry language. A document stating to increase operational intensity. Not we are working all night until further notice. But the third shift read the memo and looked at each other, and no one put on their coat. The workshop was large enough to swallow an entire city block. It smelled of welded metal, coolant, and the specific sharpness of materials pushed to the limit. Workers moved with that particular manner of tired but unstoppably efficient people, heads down, unnecessary movements eliminated. Only work remained. Master Deso Ira had run the workshop for 11 years. She had seen peak periods before military contracts, emergency modernization schedules, sometimes political decisions that translated into overtime for everyone below. She had never seen anything like this. The frames rising in Bay 7 weren't modernizations. She knew the general silhouette of every human warship class in service. She had worked on most of them at some point. These frames didn't belong to any class she recognized. They were longer than anything she had worked on. The front had a geometry she couldn't quite grasp, angles that looked wrong until you stared at them long enough to realize they were only wrong by comparison to what came before. She didn't ask questions. Over 11 years, she had learned not to ask certain questions when the documentation arrived with that level of classification. She just ensured the workshop ran 3 shifts and that no one went home until daily targets were met. She bought coffee for the third shift out of her own pocket. It felt right. The UN Security Council vote took place on day 11. 15 members, 15 votes. Yes. No debates entered into the official record. No speeches. The session lasted 4 minutes and 30 seconds, which was shorter than the time it took most members to find their seats. What they voted on was not public. Outside, 2 things were visible. First, 3 production facilities that had been running at standard capacity began running at something significantly higher. The power output itself was measurable from a distance. Hegemony sensors recorded it as industrial activity, probably civilian, possibly construction. They marked it as low priority. Second, Admiral Cressida Vane, who had been on scheduled leave after completing a patrol near the outer ring, was recalled. She was assigned a new task. The task had no public designation. She simply vanished from the leave list and, according to internal tracking, was present at an unspecified facility. A journalist from Earth's largest news platform tried to file a request with the Unified Space Command press office regarding the recall. The office responded with a form letter it sent when it had nothing to say. The journalist set it aside. She had many form letters. Vane arrived at the facility on a transport that did not appear in any civilian flight log. The facility was cold. Everything in this part of space was cold. It was a working principle of the universe that the further from something warm and alive you went, the more the cold asserted itself as the natural state of things. The facility's corridors were wide, lit by strips of dim, functional light, and smelled of cleaning agents that did their best against the underlying scent of metal and distance. Her assistant, Lieutenant Sora, met her at the airlock. He was 26, and he had that exact posture that young people have when they still believe posture matters. He had a datapad in his hand and an expression that meant he had something to tell her and wasn't sure where to start. She let him walk beside her. She looked into a bay they passed. The ships assembling there were visible through an observation window, unfinished, not even close, but formed enough to see. She stared at them for a long time. "The notification," she said. Sora looked at his datapad. He had a briefing scheduled. Personnel assignments, supply chain status, projected completion dates. "The Wred," she said. "The 9-page document they transmitted to the Unrelenting before its destruction. Get me the original, not the translation. The original in the standard Wred language, with the translation attached." He recorded it. "I will have it for you before the briefing." "I want it on the bridge." He looked up. "The bridge? On which ship will I be when we leave?" She didn't take her eyes off the observation window. "I want it framed. If we have something to frame it with. If not, print it and put it where I can see it." He recorded that too. He didn't ask why. He had been her assistant for 2 years. Over 2 years, he had learned that when she requested something without explaining herself, the explanation would become clear at a moment she had already calculated, but he had not yet reached. They walked on. She didn't say anything else for the rest of the walk. He would think about it later, about how she walked through a facility full of warships under construction for war and said only 2 things. She asked for the notification, and she said she wanted it where she could see it, not as a reminder of what had been done to them. He understood it much later. She wanted it where she could see it to remember exactly what had been said, how exactly it had been phrased, the specific language of a species that considered itself generous. The Wred received the first mathematical signal on day 19, simple sequences, a narrow beam directed at nowhere. The signal desk logged it and ran it through a standard analysis filter. The filter returned, non-hostile, non-directed mathematical pattern, consistent with research or calibration transmissions. The filter further noted that the target coordinates contained no strategic assets, populated areas, or navigational significance. Low priority. Logged, move on. The second signal came on day 23. Same format, different coordinates, still directed at nowhere. The signal desk ran the same analysis, got the same result, logged, archived. The analyst who processed both signals, a quiet, methodical person named Hetva, noticed that the two sets of coordinates had something in common. She couldn't say what immediately. The feeling was more intuitive than analytical. A sense that two things were connected before you could explain why. She opened both coordinates in her mapping system and looked at them. Oh, she didn't see the connection. She moved to the next item in her queue. She had 43 items in her queue. Vitari in cartography had a lot of time to think. Cartography was not a demanding task for a person with his experience. His previous work involved analytical pattern recognition, behavioral modeling, data reading things, requiring one to stay with something long enough for its shape to reveal itself. Cartography required precision, patience, and a willingness to update maps that hadn't changed significantly in decades. It was quiet work. He liked quiet work. He brought his personal data tablet, which contained everything he had worked on before the transfer. He reviewed it during breaks. He updated it when he got new information. Over his career, he had developed a habit of keeping two files, one for what he could prove and one for what he suspected. The second file was always larger. He added to it every few days. On day 26, the signal desk circulated the regular report, which included an addendum summarizing unusual transmissions received during the monitoring period. It was the type of document circulated to everyone in the analysis department by protocol, and which most people read through the first paragraph before moving to the next. Vitari read the whole thing. He read the section on simple sequence transmissions. Twice. He opened his cartography system. He opened the target coordinates for both signals. He stared at them for a long time. Then he opened the map of controlled red space. Every holding, every populated area, every installation of strategic value within the relevant range, a map that cartography constantly updated because that, among other things, was the purpose of cartography. He overlaid the two coordinate points. The first point coincided with nothing. The second point coincided with nothing. But between them, and extending from them, was a line, a geometric implication, a line that existed only if there were other points. A line that, if extended in the direction implied by the mathematics, passed through his console and made a quiet sound. He looked at the notification on his screen. Access to this map layer is restricted. Please contact your department head for authorization. He had been accessing this map layer every day for the last 6 weeks. It was a standard cartography resource. There was no reason for his restriction. He leaned back in his chair. He looked at the last thing he had seen before the map was blocked. The incomplete line, its continuation leading to the place it seemed to lead. He closed the console, took his personal data tablet, opened the second file, the one for things he suspected but couldn't prove. He wrote 3 sentences, then stopped. He sat like that for a minute. Then he deleted the 3 sentences and wrote one. It said, "They are aiming at nothing." On day 31, a journalist named Petra Solms, based in Rotterdam on Earth, received an anonymous data packet via a channel she used to communicate with sources. The packet contained no identifying information. It contained partial coordinate analysis data, map overlays, a series of calculations that Petra, not being a mathematician, found almost impossible to understand. At the bottom of the analysis was a handwritten note, photographed and included as an image file. The handwriting was small and neat. The note said, "I cannot tell you who I am. I can tell you that what I sent you is a pattern. I can tell you that the pattern is not yet complete, because they have not finished sending signals. I can tell you that when it is complete, you will understand what it means without needing my explanation. Please watch for the rest of the signals. Please keep this safe." Petra read the note several times. She was a journalist who had covered military issues for 9 years. She had a knack for things that were hidden not in a mystical way, just the way a person develops instincts after years of watching people try to say nothing while meaning everything. She realized this was either very important or completely meaningless. For now, she couldn't tell. She saved the packet in her most secure vault. She set up alerts for any new signals matching the described format. She sat on it. She sat on it for 3 days, which was the longest possible before the thing living in the back of her head, where important information went for walks, made it impossible to think about anything else. Then she made a few calls. The Hegemony Xenopsychology Department submitted its 3 one-day assessment. It was the most uncertain document the department had produced in 40 years. The lead author, Svitara, insisted on phrasing reflecting what they actually knew, namely, very little rather than what the council wanted to hear, namely, reassurance. The document stated in its summary, "Human silence now exceeds all precedents in our database of post-correction behavioral reactions. We cannot accurately model this reaction because we do not have an equivalent dataset. We do not know what they are doing. We do not know what they intend. We are looking at the outside of a process inside which we cannot see." It stated this should worry them. It stated, "We recommend a substantial expansion of our intelligence resources aimed at human internal communications and production activity. We recommend this immediately." The council received the document on day 31. They debated it on day 33. The recommendation to expand intelligence resources was approved in principle for implementation over the next 40 cycles through standard channels. 40 cycles. On day 38, Yara Osei received a personal message from her mother. It was a short message. Her mother wasn't one for long messages. She said she had been thinking of Yara and wanted to make sure she was eating enough because she always stopped eating when she was stressed. She said Yara's younger brother had passed his engineering exams and the family was very proud. She said she had lit a candle at a memorial service for the Unrelenting's crew because it felt right, even if she didn't personally know any of them. She ended the message, "Come home when you can, baby. Will this ever end?" Yara read the message twice. She thought about writing back. She wanted to say, "I don't think you know what end means now. I don't think any of us do." She wanted to say, "I saw the debris field, Mom. I watched it on my screen, and it was 11 minutes. I want you to understand that 11 minutes is the time it takes to end the lives of 847 people, and we are silent about it. We are very silent, and that silence is nothing." She wrote back, "I'm eating fine. Give Marcus my congratulations. I love you." She sent it, returned to her console. On passive scan, nothing unusual. The corridor was empty. The debris field was drifting further now, scattered by the slow mechanics of space. Along the wider spread, nothing of note. She made entries in her watch log. She did not record the third signal. It arrived at 2:11. Same format, new coordinates. She looked at where they pointed, then closed the window and didn't open it again. Some things were not intended for Red intercept teams. Some things were only for those who were going to be there. Day 41, Titan, the 7th day. The ships weren't finished. They wouldn't be finished for several weeks. But the first lead ship, on which Cressida Vane and the notification now framed in functional black metal would be, was close enough. She walked her ship from bow to stern at 5:00 a.m. The crew was alert, all of them. Not because they had been ordered to. No one had told them anything about this morning. They were just alert, standing at their posts, or in the corridor, or by the observation viewports, watching her walk. She didn't give a speech. She wasn't a person who gave speeches before actions. Speeches were for afterward, when there was something to say about what had happened. Before that, there was only the work. She walked to the bridge. She stood before the notification, 9 paragraphs. Red standard on the left, translation to English on the right, framed in black on the wall in front of her navigation console, where she saw it every time she looked up. She read it once from beginning to end. She thought about the Unrelenting. The crew manifest, 847 names, and she forced herself to memorize them all, even the ones she didn't know, because it seemed important to carry them with you. She thought about the last paragraph of the notification, the part that invited the human government to respond via official channels. Generosity. They called it generosity. Sora appeared on the edge of her vision. He had a data pad with today's status reports and an expression meaning everything was on schedule. She said, "Tell me we are ready." He said, "Ready enough." She nodded once. Then we are ready. She looked at the notification again. She thought, we received it, we acknowledged it, and now we will respond. The fleet exited hyperspace at 3:40 a.m. Relay time, 61 ships. They emerged from superluminal space in a formation the red planetary defense sensors had never seen before. Not a standard combat formation, not an assault wedge, not any of the recognized patterns in the Hegemony's tactical database. The formation was dense in the center and wide at the edges, as if designed not to attack one point, but to fill the space completely. As if designed to make escape difficult. The Ketchavara Planetary Defense Commander was a veteran officer named Sotvan, who had held his post for 12 years. He had conducted 17 emergency drills. He had reacted to 2 minor intrusion incidents and 1 navigational accident that briefly looked like something worse. He was not, by anyone's standards, an unprepared man. He looked at his sensor screen for about 4 seconds. Then he pressed the emergency alert. Ketchavara was the oldest colonial world of the Hegemony, not the most populated, not the most productive, not strategically important in any sense a military analyst could circle on a map. But it was the first world the Hegemony had ever colonized outside its home system 400 years ago, when the species was young and expanding and full of that particular energy that comes from believing the universe is large enough for everyone to have a share. The first settlers arrived on generation ships, slow by modern standards, and they landed on a world of redstone plains and shallow inland seas, a sky that had a specific amber tint at sunset that could not be found anywhere else in the known systems. They built, they gave it a name, they buried their dead in the red stone and called this world home, and their children called it home, and the children of their children. And 400 years of such accumulation, until Ketchavara was not just a place, but a word that meant something in the history of the Hegemony in its schools. In that particular pride, a civilization feels for the first step it ever took outside itself. Now 340 million people lived there. Most of them were sleeping. When Sotvan pressed the emergency alert, the human fleet's first transmission was not a weapon. Sotvan activated his defense network within 90 seconds of the fleet's arrival, which was faster than in drills. Adrenaline tightened his steps, and he had a targeting solution on the 6 lead human ships within the first 2 minutes. And he waited for the command to fire, when his communications officer said very carefully, "Sir, they are broadcasting. Not a targeting signal, not a tactical signal. Audio on all frequencies, my system monitors, in the standard red language." "Turn it on," he said. The voice was human, flat, unhurried. Clearly a recording, not a live speaker. It said, "This is a notification from the Unified Space Command to the population of Ketchavara and all Hegemony personnel in this system. You have 4 hours to evacuate. All civilian vessels leaving the system will not be fired upon. All civilian vessels leaving the system will be granted free passage. Medical and emergency vessels will be granted priority passage. This window opens now." Then it repeated. Then it continued to repeat. Sotvan stared at his communications console. The recording began again from the beginning. He realized after some time that the voice was reading an unprepared statement. No, something specific. He listened closer, and then he recognized the rhythm, the formal structure, the legal phrasing. He had heard this document before. Everyone in the Hegemony who followed diplomatic channels had heard this document. It was the notification, the 9-page notification the Hegemony had filed before the destruction of the Unrelenting. Each word was read aloud in the standard red language on loop. They had sent the notification, and now the humans were playing it back. He sat with it for a second. 2. The recording reached the paragraph about the generous provision of official channels. It continued. It continued for 4 hours. Every human on Ketchavara who had a communication device heard it. Every person waking to the emergency alert heard their own words read back to them by those who had come to answer them. He opened the Planetary Civilian Defense Channel. He said, "Begin evacuation protocol. Full priority for civilians. Everything that can fly must get into the air." His deputy said, "Sir, we are answering with fire." He looked at the sensor ribbon. 61 ships held position, not advancing, not aiming, waiting for 4 hours with a patience that, in Sotvan's opinion, was the most terrifying thing he had encountered in 12 years of defense work. "Not yet," he said. He wasn't sure if the word "yet" was the right one. He used it because it was the only word his training gave him in this situation, and his training over 12 years had not prepared him for this situation. He began to count the ships. How many did he have? How many did they have? What did the math say? He knew what the math said. He went on the Civilian Defense Channel. On board the lead human ship, the UNSC Relentless, Admiral Cressida Vane stood at the forward viewport. Her hands were clasped behind her back. It was a habit, something she did when she needed her hands where they wouldn't interfere with her thinking. She had done it since her first assignment as a commander 15 years ago, standing at viewports that were significantly less impressive than this, looking at significantly less significant things. She looked at Ketchavara from about 12 kilometers away. At that distance it was a disk of amber, rust, and the dark blue of its shallow seas. The amber sky was visible even from here, as a thin, bright line at the edges where the atmosphere caught the system's star. It was a beautiful world. She hadn't expected that. She had reviewed the survey data, geographical reports, population distribution maps, all the practical information. She hadn't thought to look at photographs. She had found one last night in a civilian archive, an amateur photo taken by a settler's descendant about 60 years ago. Standing on one of the red stone plains with the amber sky behind and the nearest sea visible on the horizon, the person in the photo was old, and she was smiling, and she was standing on the soil of the world her family had lived on for 4 generations. Vane stared at the photo for a long time. She thought about it now. Sora appeared at the edge of her vision. He had a status report. Evacuation flows, civilian defense communication, the number of ships leaving Ketchavara's atmosphere, updated every 15 minutes. She said, "How many are moving? Civilian defense activated within 4 minutes of our message. They are moving fast." He looked at the datapad. Preliminary estimate? Departure rate is approximately 2 million per hour. If it holds, it won't hold. It will slow down. She had studied evacuation data for weeks. The population moved fast at first, when the fear was pure and simple, then slowed. People went back for things. People refused to leave. People who had nowhere to go stood in the middle of the street because the choice between leaving everything and leaving did not feel like a choice at all. "We are registering every ship that leaves the system," she said. "Already working on it." "Everything, Sora. I want the count to be continuous." He said, "Yes, Admiral." She looked at the world. She thought about the photo, about the old woman, about the amber sky, about 4 generations of a family and the red stone land. She thought about the destruction report filed before the heat signatures had vanished. She thought, this is what we decided to become to bring them to the table. She thought, I need to know this was true. She clasped her hands tighter behind her back. She watched the evacuation ships rising into the air. Inside Ketchavara, it looked like this. The emergency alert woke people in the middle of the night. An alien voice, speaking in the standard red language on all devices in every home. The notification repeated. Recognizable from the first sentence to everyone who had read the news over the last 2 months, which was everyone. Most people moved immediately. The specific animal intelligence living lower than thought and training said, 61 ships, 4 hours, and their legs were already moving before the brain finished the calculation. Some people did not move. An old man in the capital named Red Soul, who was born on Ketchavara, and whose parents were born on Ketchavara, and whose grandparents helped survey the southern Redstone Plains before he was a thought in anyone's mind, sat in his kitchen listening to the broadcast, looking out the window and looking at his hands, and he didn't get up. His daughter found him there 40 minutes later. She had come back for him after she had put the children on an evacuation transport. She stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "Father, we must go." He looked at her. He said, "I was born in this house." She said, "I know." He said, "My mother is buried 3 streets from here." She said, "Father." The broadcast repeated. The notification, patient and mechanical, read itself to everyone who could hear it. He stood up. He didn't take anything. He walked out of the house and didn't look at it again, because he knew that if he looked, he would stop, and he could not stop. His daughter took his hand, and they walked to the transport, and they left. 3 hours and 51 minutes after the window opened, the Relentless filed the final evacuation count. 331 million. It stood in the command center that was powering down around him. Secondary systems were shutting down sequentially. His remaining personnel were moving to evacuation transports. He stayed as long as he could. He told himself he would stay until the last transport, which had left 11 minutes ago. Now he told himself he would stay until the end of the window, which had 9 minutes left. He looked at the sensor ribbon. The human fleet hadn't moved for 4 hours. It held formation. It hadn't fired anything. It just sat there, 61 ships, broadcasting the notification on all frequencies, and waited. 9 million people hadn't made it to the transports. He had this number in his head, and he couldn't put it anywhere useful. 9 million. It was too big a number to hold. It constantly slipped away when he tried to think about it directly. So he thought about it sideways. He thought about specific streets in the capital, specific districts, the market near the central station that worked all night, the school his children attended before he moved them to the home planet. He thought about the specific weight of the ordinary lives of 9 million people, and he couldn't hold that either. He grabbed his command kit, walked to the last transport. He didn't look at the sensor ribbon as he left. He didn't need to. He knew what would soon appear on it. Vane watched the window close. The counter on her secondary screen flipped over. 4 hours, 0 minutes, 0 seconds. She said, "Begin." The fleet moved with a precision achieved through months of preparation. Not fast, not dramatic, not the type of overwhelming onslaught that impresses on a tactical display. Methodical, with intervals, a sequence of targets. The weapons the fleet carried were non-standard collision munitions. They were designed specifically for this mission by engineers given one operational requirement: constancy. Not speed, not purity in the sense of leaving everything intact constancy. Sora stood beside her. He didn't say anything. The bridge crew worked in that special silence of people who do the hard thing they decided to do, and for which they have no more words. She kept her hands clasped behind her back. She watched the weapons reach the surface sequentially, working from the populated areas, methodically, interval by interval. The planet's atmosphere illuminated in places not with fire, exactly, but with a release of energy that had its own color, something between orange and white, something that made the amber sky briefly look the way it had always looked before it became something else. She thought about the notification, about all 9 paragraphs, repeating in the ears of everyone who was woken in the dark and told they had 4 hours. She thought, they filed it like a delivery receipt. She thought, 847 people. She stood at the viewport the whole time. She didn't look away. She had decided before launching the mission that she would not look away, that looking away was what people did when they wanted to do something without taking responsibility for it. She was responsible for this. She had given every order that led to this moment. She had signed every document. Every morning of this mission, she had stood before the notification on her wall and read all 9 paragraphs, thought about the Unrelenting, and thought about what it took to get to that table, at which the hegemony was not yet sitting and would not sit until they understood something. This was the only language in which certain things could be spoken. She didn't like it. She didn't look away. Sora updated the evacuation count at the end. He didn't say it out loud. He put it on her secondary screen. She read it. 331 million out. She said, "Log it." He said, "Already logged. Everything window, count, departure time, every ship that left the system." "Yes, Admiral." She looked at what remained of Ketchavara on her sensor screen. From 12,000 kilometers it looked different. Amber, rust, and dark blue had been replaced by something uniformly gray, like the color of a completed thing. The shallow seas were gone. The red stone plains were gone. The amber sky, which made sunsets of a particular color that no other world could repeat, had vanished. She thought about the old woman in the photo, standing on the red stone plain 60 years ago, smiling. She thought, "Forgive me." She didn't say it out loud. She turned away from the viewport. She said, "Next coordinates, standard transition." The fleet moved. The notification continued to broadcast behind them, still looping on frequencies until the signal finally faded into the distance, the background static of the cosmos. Just one sound the universe made, indistinguishable, in the end, from everything else that traveled through the dark in search of something to reach. Ketchavara remained in place, named empty. At a listening post 17 light minutes away, Yara Ose was not on duty. She was in her bunk, with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling of the small metal room she had occupied for 8 months. She had calculated the time. She knew, from the fleet's last recorded position, roughly when it would reach Ketchavara. She didn't go to her console to watch. Instead, she lay in her bunk in the darkness with her eyes open. She thought about Declan Rowe. She thought about the band no one else knew, about the 1 6-hour transfer, about the polite pretense. She thought, "I hope you knew it was important." She thought, "I hope someone said it clearly." She lay in the darkness until the start of her shift. Then she got up, went to her console, logged in, did her job. Outside in the corridor, Technician Brass was making coffee. She could smell it. She could hear the specific sound of the machine they had repaired 3 times, and which now only worked if you pressed the side panel during heating. He brought her a cup without asking. She wrapped both hands around it. She said thanks. He said, yeah. They didn't talk about Ketchavara. There was nothing that could be said about it that the universe wasn't already saying in the specific silence of a world that had been named for 400 years and was now, for the first time, quiet. The Red sent 40 ambassadors. They arrived at the neutral station near the Ketwara crossroads on a ship that was, by design, clearly unarmed. The station was old, built 300 years ago as a trading post, expanded twice, now used almost exclusively for diplomatic meetings between species that didn't trust each other enough to meet anywhere else. The walls were the color of old bone, and the air recycling system made a faint sound every 40 seconds that the people who worked there had long since stopped hearing. The 40 ambassadors wore their formal attire, dark gray robes with silver thread at the collar, the attire the hegemony used when it wanted to signal seriousness and authority without aggression. They had materials prepared, position papers, legal frameworks, a detailed report of precedents from the 43 previous correction cases, all of which had been resolved through negotiation. They had a lead speaker, Ambassador Wred Oa, who had personally overseen 11 of these resolutions and who was, by any reasonable measure, the most experienced diplomatic mind the hegemony could send. They sat at a long table in the main meeting room of the neutral station and waited. The human delegation arrived 11 minutes late. One woman in a gray civilian suit of the type you could buy in any standard store, nothing impressive. A cup of tea in her hand that was already a little too cold to be fresh, no datapad, no materials, no visible support staff. She sat across from the 40 ambassadors and their combined century of diplomatic experience, placed the tea on the table, and said, Dr. Marin Foss, Special Envoy. Then she looked at Ambassador Wred Oa and waited. Wred Oa, who had begun negotiations with 11 civilizations and never felt insecure in the shape of a room, felt insecure in the shape of the room. He began, anyway. He was a professional. He laid out the hegemony's position. The corridor was disputed territory by hegemony law, a long-standing claim, documented and registered, available in public record. The Unrelenting had received 3 notifications within 2 standard cycles. The hegemony had followed all required protocols. The outcome, while regrettable, was legal within the legal system, regulating enforcement in disputed zones. He said the word regrettable twice. Dr. Foss listened to everything. She didn't move. She didn't write anything. She looked at him the way a person looks at a door when waiting for it to open. When he finished, she said, "We received your notification." Wred Oa waited for more. There was nothing more, he continued. He explained that the hegemony, as a gesture of goodwill, was prepared to begin official discussions on the corridor's status. A joint commission, a joint administrative structure. The hegemony would consider human access to commercial shipping in the corridor within the framework of a structured agreement with relevant fees and schedules. He said the word goodwill once. Dr. Foss sipped her cold tea. She said, "We received your notification." The room was quiet. One of the 40 ambassadors shifted in his chair. It was a small movement, the type of movement a person makes when they realize the conversation they were preparing for is not the conversation happening. Ketchavara had already vanished by the end of the first session. The news came over the station's public relay while the Red delegation was returning to their quarters. One of the junior ambassadors saw it first on his personal device and stopped so abruptly that the person behind him crashed into his back. The senior staff gathered in the delegation's private room. They opened the sensor data from the relay. They watched what remained of Ketchavara on the screen, which, in any meaningful sense, was not there. The bombardment had been precise and complete. The evacuation window was 4 hours. The human fleet had broadcast in all Red languages before the first shot was fired. A colonial world with 340 million inhabitants, 331 million of whom had managed to get out. 9 million? No. The hegemony hadn't had 9 million casualties in one engagement in over 100 years. Ambassador Wred Oa sat in his chair and stared at the screen and didn't speak for a long time. Then he requested an emergency session with Dr. Foss the next morning. She agreed. She asked to start the session no earlier than 9. She said she would prefer to have breakfast first. The second session began at exactly 9:00 a.m. Wred brought new materials. The Hegemony had authorized him to offer an official charge against Savitur, the admiral who had commanded the Unrelenting's destruction. Criminal prosecution. Responsibility at the highest visible level. 3 other fleet commanders would stand for review. The Oversight Council that had approved the enforcement policy in disputed zones would be dissolved. A new structure for interaction in disputed zones, jointly developed with human representatives, would replace it. He said all of this in a voice that was very flat and very tired. Dr. Foss said, "We received your notification." Then she said, "This is the Hegemony's decision. The prosecution of your admiral is your business, not ours." Wred said, "Then what is your business?" She paused for a moment. "The schedule," she said. He waited. "We are on schedule," she said. "It does not change depending on what is proposed here, nor what would change it." She looked at her tea. She seemed to really consider the question, which was somehow worse than if she had dismissed it. "I don't know," she finally said. "That is an honest answer. I was sent here to accept proposals, not to make decisions. The people making the decision are not at this table. Then who is at this table? Who received your notification?" Vitari had been in cartography for 6 weeks when the 4th planet was announced. He found out the way everyone in the Hegemony found out, via the public relay that the High Council had stopped trying to suppress after Ketchavara, because suppression at that scale was impossible, and the attempt itself made things worse. The 4th planet was called Savevra, a historical world, old, a place that existed in the Hegemony's cultural memory not because of what it produced, but because of what it meant. The evacuation window had come and gone. 22 million people had gotten out. What remained of Savevra was the same as everything else the humans had touched. Nothing. Vitari sat at his cartography console and looked at the updated map he kept in his personal file, not the official Hegemony map, which was updated through proper channels, and which no longer showed Ketchavara or Red Sanok or others as populated worlds, only as coordinates with a new classification for which the system had no label 3 months ago, but now had one that everyone agreed to silently and without discussion. Never speak it aloud if they could help it. He looked at the pattern. He had looked at the pattern for weeks. He had carefully mapped it. All human signals, all target coordinates, fleet movement as reported via relay, worlds that had been struck. He overlaid everything. He performed the analysis he had been forbidden from doing when his access was restricted, using other sources, public sources, information that existed in plain sight if one stared at it long enough and in the right order. The pattern was random. He had known that from the beginning. But now that 4 worlds had vanished, he could see what it was. They were not striking the Hegemony's military power. They were not striking what would win a war in the traditional sense. They were striking memory. They were striking things that, if removed, would change what the Hegemony was. Ketchavara, the oldest colonial world, the first the Hegemony had ever colonized outside its home system, the foundational myth of expansion. Red Sanok, the industrial engine that had built every warship in the fleet that destroyed the Unrelenting. Savevra, the historical center, the place where the Hegemony's foundational documents were kept. He looked at his map. He thought about what came next in the pattern. He thought about Red Mora, home to the Hegemony's central government, the residence of the High Council, the most populated world for the Red outside the home world itself. He thought about Petra Solms, the journalist from Rotterdam to whom he had sent the initial data packet 6 weeks ago. He hadn't been in touch with her since. He didn't know if she had acted on the information. He didn't know if it mattered. He opened his personal data tablet. He stared at it for a long time. Then he composed a new message. Everything, a full analysis, clear and complete. The pattern laid out so clearly that anyone with basic spatial reasoning could trace it. Projections, forward. Which worlds were next if the pattern continued? And why? And what each represented in the cultural architecture of the Hegemony. And at the bottom, what he had carried alone for 6 weeks, he wrote, "The humans are not trying to defeat us. They are trying to make us understand something. I do not know if there is a number of worlds that ends this. I do not think they know, but I know this. What they are taking from us is not territory. Territory can be returned. What they are taking is the story we tell about who we are. When that is gone, there is nothing left to negotiate." He sent it. This time, he sent it to everyone, not just Petra Solms, not just one journalist. He sent it to all public press channels. all civilian relays, all open communication networks. He used the broadcast credentials of the cartography department, which would expire as soon as his supervisor saw what he had done, but which, for the next 40 minutes, gave his message the same priority and distribution as official hegemony messages. He leaned back. His console would be locked in 40 minutes. He would be removed from his post. He didn't know what would happen to him next. He had stopped calculating that specific calculation because it led to places that made continuing difficult, and continuing was necessary. He looked at the map. He thought, someone has to say it out loud. The Red public found out by morning. The unadorned version, the one the High Council was releasing through official channels, the version that called the destroyed world's administrative adjustments and described the human fleet's actions in language designed to present them as a controlled, managed event, was one thing. The real version, Vitari's version, with maps and pattern analysis and forecasts, was read by everyone who wanted to read it. The reaction was not what the High Council had feared. It was quieter. People read it and froze, just as Yara Osei had frozen at the listening post 17 light minutes from the debris field, just as Vitari had frozen in cartography with an open map and a visible pattern, the freezing of a being that had been given a name after a long period of namelessness. The High Council gathered. It was the longest session in modern council history. 19 hours continuously, with food brought in at the 7th hour because it became clear it wouldn't end. Vitari's analysis sat in the center of the table, printed, annotated by 4 different council members in 4 different colors. They debated options. They eventually debated the question Vitari hadn't quite asked, but had made inevitable by writing everything else. Is there a number? Is there a number of worlds that will make them stop? The intelligence department was asked to answer. The response came in writing, which was unusual. The intelligence department almost never communicated in writing with the whole council. The document consisted of 11 pages. The summary was one line: unknown. Behavioral modeling is impossible. The species has no historical precedent for estimating an endpoint. One council member asked the intelligence chief, who was present in person, to explain what that meant. The intelligence chief, a very old Red who had done this job for 40 years and possessed a quality of absolute honesty that was either his greatest strength or the reason he would never rise higher than he already was, said, "It means they have never stopped before. Every war they have fought in their recorded history, and there were many, more than ours, against one another over trifles they have seen through to the end. We do not know what their end is here because we have never given them a reason to define it, until now." He paused. "We gave them one," he said. 11 minutes. 847 people, and a notification filed like a delivery receipt. The room was very quiet. "I would recommend," he said, "that we find out what that number is." "How?" asked the council. "By asking," he said. "Not offering, not bargaining, asking." Red Oa arrived at the 5th session with nothing in his hands, no materials, no data pad, no position papers. He sat across from Dr. Foss and her cold tea, clasped his hands on the table and said, "I have been authorized to ask you a direct question." Dr. Foss waited. "Is there a number?" he said. "That ends this?" She looked at him. Something moved behind her eyes. Not surprise, but recognition. The way a person looks when what they have been waiting for arrives. She said, "I will take this question to the people who make the decision." "How long will that take?" "Not long," she said. She picked up her tea. She set it back down. "Whatever it takes," she said, and her voice was no different than it had been in every other session. The same flat professional tone. There was nothing in it that could be called cruel, nothing that could be called kind. It was just level, just present. "I think that was a reasonable question. I think you should have asked it earlier." Red Oa looked at his hands on the table. He said, "I think so too." The session lasted 6 minutes. It was the shortest so far, but it was, in all significant senses, the first. Outside the neutral station, in the cold of outer space, the human fleet was already moving to the next coordinates on its schedule. It had received no new orders. It wouldn't receive them for another 3 days. It kept moving. The schedule did not wait for conversations. The schedule was what had been decided on day 11, in a session that lasted 4 minutes and 30 seconds, by 15 votes. No debates, no speeches, and it moved with the same speed it had always intended to move, regardless of everything happening behind the table at the old station, smelling of recycled air and unfinished negotiations. It moved, and 3 days later, When the answer came from the people making the decision, it came in the form of a number. Wred read it. He closed his eyes. He sat like that for a moment, alone in his apartment. The station hummed around him. Then he opened his eyes. He took his communication console. He had work to do. The armistice was signed on Tuesday. No one had planned it. The day of the week wasn't something anyone had considered when the final terms were agreed upon and the signing session was scheduled. It was just the day it happened. And later, when people would write about it, they would note Tuesday, just as they noted unremarkable weather on the day of an important event, not because it mattered, but because its ordinariness contrasted so strangely with the size of the thing. On Tuesday, the Wred Hegemony and the Unified Space Command signed an armistice agreement in the main meeting room of the neutral station on the Ketwara Crossroads, in the presence of 12 witnesses and 1 recording system, in a room smelling of recycled air and having walls the color of old bone. The agreement was 47 pages long. The first appendix was a list of names, all 847 of them from the Unrelenting, printed fully in both standard human and formal red language, beginning with the commander and ending with the youngest crew member, the 19-year-old engineering assistant who was 6 weeks out of training and who, according to the entry in his personal file that no one had ever read except his commander, brewed the best coffee on the ship. It was the Hegemony High Council that had requested the appendix. They requested it because the published analysis by Vitari had made it clear, in simple language, that now the entire Hegemony population had read that this all started with 847 people who had been filed like a delivery receipt. The council realized, by the time they sat down to finalize the terms, that the record had to contain the names, that the names had to be the first thing in the document, before territorial provisions, before the reparations schedule, before the new structure for interaction in disputed zones, before everything else, the names. Ambassador Wred signed his part with a steady hand. He had been doing this job for 60 years. He had signed 11 previous agreements, all of them from the other side of the table, all with a species that had come to terms with what the hegemony was. He signed this one from the side of the table he had never sat on before, and he kept his face very still and did not allow himself to think about the number 7 until he returned to his apartment alone and closed the door. 7. He sat in a chair and said the word out loud once, because it felt like something that needed to be spoken with a real voice in a real room, rather than just existing as a digit in a document. 7 worlds. He had negotiated an armistice for 7. He didn't know, when he had asked the question, that the answer would be 7. He didn't know what it would feel like to feel 7 when it came. It felt like a door that had been open for a long time was finally closing. He wasn't sure from which side. The galaxy was quietly reordering itself, not all at once, not with announcements or ceremonies, or any formal structures civilizations use when they want to mark a shift. It happened the way big things usually happen, gradually and completely, through 1,000 small decisions made by 1,000 separate parties, each of which was individually just updating its understanding of how things were now. The Sulithva, small, purple, and perpetually anxious, had watched the situation from the beginning. They had 17 diplomatic observers at the Ketwara Crossroads, who filed reports every 6 hours. When the armistice was signed, their High Council gathered and spent 9 hours reviewing a full report on everything that had happened since the Unrelenting was destroyed. At the end of the 9 hours, their foreign minister sent a message to the Human Diplomatic Office. The message was brief. It said the Sulithva were moved by humanity's commitment to its people and wished to open formal trade negotiations at the first mutual convenience. The Human Diplomatic Office responded within a day. The Sulithva foreign minister, reading the response, felt what she would later describe to her staff as a particular relief that she had spent too long fearing the wrong thing. Other species followed suit, some quickly, some after a period of thorough internal deliberation, some through intermediaries who could maintain plausible distance if the relations turned out to be a mistake. None of them announced what they were doing in simple words. None of them had to. The reordering was happening in the language of trade agreements and navigation treaties and quietly updated threat assessments in military files that wouldn't be declassified for decades. The record of the Wred Hegemony's destructions, 43 corrected civilizations, logged, archived, became a historical document, the type studied in academic circles, the type that had a before and after date. Savevra's case. The judicial proceedings lasted 3 weeks. They were conducted within the hegemony's own legal system. As Dr. Foss had noted, This was the hegemony's decision. The human government sent no representative, filed no statements. The trial was conducted entirely under Wred law, by Wred judges, and the Wred legal code, which previously had no applicable category for what Saavedra had done, because what he had done had always, until now, been under the category of enforcement and stayed there. His defense argued that he had followed all established protocols, that the notification had been issued, that the vessel had not complied, that his actions were legal, supported by precedent, approved at all levels of the command structure above him. All of this was true. The court found him guilty anyway, not because the law stated he was guilty. The law was indeed unclear, because it was written in a time when enforcement was what you did to species that hadn't yet learned the shape of the world. The court found him guilty because the High Council, during those 19 hours of continuous session, had passed amendments to the relevant structure. And the amendments were backdated to the date of the Unrelenting's destruction, which was legally unusual, challenged by 4 different defense groups, and would be contested in administrative courts for years. The sentence: removal from service and a lifetime restriction on any command position. He accepted it. He stood in court and listened to the verdict and said nothing. He had known, from the night he read the 2-sentence response and felt the ground shift beneath him, that something like this was coming. He knew it the way you know something that lives in your body before it lives in your head. He returned to his apartment on Red Mora to retrieve his things. He stood one last time in his command room, the same room where he had watched the data from the Unrelenting sensors, the same screen, the same pale blue light. He opened the destruction report. He looked at the category under which it had been saved. Miscalculation. He himself had changed it a few weeks ago, that night when everything started becoming clear. He had created the category because the existing ones didn't fit. He looked at it now and thought, is it the right word? Is miscalculation honest enough for what it was? He decided it was the most honest word he had. He closed the file, took his personal belongings, and left the ship. He didn't look back at it. He was the type of person who, after 43 corrections and 1 very long retribution, had learned that looking back at things does not change them. Vitari was offered a job. The offer came from the Bureau of Post-War Restoration, a new department created under the terms of the armistice to oversee the documentation and possible governance of the 7 destroyed worlds. The Bureau needed people who understood spatial data, cartography, the specific discipline of observing a place and accurately recording what was there, not what you wished was there. The offer letter noted his previous work, his analysis, the fact that he had published it at personal cost using credentials he knew would be revoked as soon as anyone noticed. His credentials were revoked within an hour. He had been suspended, officially investigated, acquitted on technical grounds because, as it turned out, the broadcast credentials of the cartography department were not restricted for personal use by any existing rules, a gap in policy. The investigation was closed with a finding of no violations and a recommendation to update relevant policies. He read the offer letter twice. The work consisted of cataloging what had been lost, moving to the 7 coordinates, and accurately recording what was there, now creating a permanent, accurate record that couldn't be revised or reclassified, or stored under language that softened it. He wrote his response the same day. He said, yes. He packed a bag. He requested a transport assignment. He stood by the window of his small apartment in the cartography department's housing block. He looked at the hegemonic city that stretched out from him in all directions. Old, dense, and still there, still whole. And he thought about the 7 worlds that would never look like that again. He thought, someone has to look at this clearly. That was all. He took his bag and left. The 7 worlds remained empty. There was debate about this significant debate in the human government and the post-armistice joint commission created to manage current relations. The reparations agreement gave the Wred Hegemony full right to rebuild on the destroyed worlds if it chose to do so. The resources were available. The engineering capacity existed. What had been lost was not irreparable from a purely physical point of view. The Joint Commission discussed this option in the 2nd session, then the 5th, then the 9th. Each time, the discussion boiled down to the same unresolved question. What were these worlds now? If you rebuild them, they become something new, a new colonial center, a new production center, a new historical center. What they were has vanished. You can build over an absence, but you cannot fill it. And the absence 7 coordinates, in the navigation maps of every registered ship in the known galaxy, was something. It wasn't nothing. It was, as one member of the Human Commission said, quiet. At the ninth session, it was the only honest record of what had happened, the only version of events that couldn't be revised by another government in another decade, or softened by language, or stored under a category that would make it easier to bear. 7 coordinates, 7 names, unchanged on the maps. Ketchavara, Red Sanok, Savevra, and 4 others. Still there, still named, now empty. The commission voted to leave them as they were. No one recorded how the vote went. No one needed to. Cressida Vane returned home on Wednesday. The ship that carried her back crossed the distance she had traveled leaving, which had felt purposeful and direct, and had a clear shape, the shape of moving toward something. Returning was different. Returning just felt like distance. She had her quarters. She slept more than usual, which surprised her. And then she realized her body was paying off a debt it had accrued over months. She ate in the crew mess when she didn't want to be alone, and in her quarters when she did, she read. She hadn't read anything other than tactical documents and status reports for so long that the experience of reading something just because she wanted to felt vaguely strange, like using a muscle that had become stiff. Sora knocked on her cabin door on the 3rd day of the return. She let him in. He sat on the chair across from her table, which he had never done while on duty. He always stood unless ordered otherwise. The posture of a person who hadn't stopped being 26 and unsure of his place. He sat because they were technically no longer on duty, and he was trying to figure out how to be around her without the structure of service to organize it. She understood. She was trying to figure out the same thing. He asked, "How is she?" She said she was doing well. He didn't push. He talked about other things, his plans when they docked, a friend he was going to see, the small details of a life that had been on pause and was now starting up again. She listened. It was pleasant to listen to small things. Small things had been very far, for a very long time. When he left, she sat at the table for a while. Then she went to the bridge. It was quiet. The transit crew. The man at the navigation console nodded to her, and she nodded back and stood at the forward viewport and looked at the passing stars. Not dramatic. They didn't blur. They didn't blur. Space travel at that speed just looked like stars. The same stars in slightly different positions than before. The notification was still on the wall. She hadn't taken it down. She didn't know what would happen to it when she got home. She thought about it. She thought about the 9 paragraphs and the 2 sentences of the response, and the 41 days of silence, and the 61 ships, 7 worlds, Himani Pata, Talfa, 19 years old, best coffee on the ship, first appendix, last name on the list. She stood there until the navigation crew changed. Then she went to sleep. Her apartment was the same. That always surprised her. When she returned after a long assignment, she had been gone for months, and the apartment just continued to exist without any of it having mattered to it. The same small kitchen, the same window that looked out over a city that wasn't beautiful but was hers, dense and functional and full of light at night. That type of light that meant people were awake there, living their ordinary lives in an ordinary way. She unpacked, bought groceries at the corner store that had been there since she moved in and would probably be there after she left. The person behind the counter recognized her and said, "Welcome home," and she said, "Thanks," and meant it in a way that was hard to explain. She made a meal, ate, washed the dishes, went to bed at a reasonable time, woke up at 4 a.m., and couldn't fall back asleep. She stood at the kitchen window. The city was mostly dark. The late-night lights were giving way to the first thin edge of a morning that wasn't quite morning yet. She had a glass of water. She stood and looked at the city and thought. Her personal communicator beeped. Sora. She had given him her personal number before they docked because he asked, and it felt right. She answered. His voice was slightly hesitant, the way he became when he wasn't sure if he was crossing boundaries. He said he had been thinking of her and just wanted to know how she was. Sorry for the time. He saw the time and almost didn't call. She said she was glad he called. He asked how she was. She said, "I'm thinking about the notification all the time." A slight pause. "The red one? 9 pages?" "Yes." She looked at the city. The light began changing very slowly at the furthest edge of the sky. "We had 847 people on that ship." "I know." She paused for a moment. "I don't know what the right number was," she said. He didn't answer immediately. She was glad he didn't answer immediately. She didn't want a quick answer. She wasn't sure she wanted an answer at all. She wanted to say it to someone who would understand what she was actually saying. 7, she said. "We stopped at 7. I gave the order to stop at 7, and I'd like to say I knew it was right when I gave it, But I'm not sure I know now. You brought them to the table, he said. I brought them to the table at 7. If it had been 5, they would have come. If it had been 4. If it had been 3, he said quietly. You couldn't have known. No, I couldn't. She pressed her fingers against the cold window glass. Outside, the city slowly breathed its night breath. She thought about Ketchavara, the first, standing at the forward viewport, hands clasped behind her back, watching the evacuation ships leave the atmosphere, watching the fleet perform the task with an almost mechanical precision that had been planned down to the intervals she had personally approved, and thinking, this is what we decided to become to bring them to the table. She thought about the 9 million people who didn't make it to the ships. Not didn't make it, hadn't. Past tense. Already a fixed thing. I'm counting all the time, she said, forward and back. What if we had stopped sooner? What if we hadn't stopped at 7? Sora said, Vane. She waited. 847 people, he said. You carried them the whole time. I watched you, and I don't think you'll ever stop carrying them. But I also think that if anyone was destined to sit in that chair, making those decisions... He paused. I think it had to be someone who wouldn't sleep well after this. She stood at her window. The edge of the sky was turning orange very slowly, the way morning always came, not at once. Just a gradual persistence. Light taking back what the night had stolen. I'll call you later, she said. Okay. She hung up. She stood at the window until the city was fully lit, until the streets below were in motion. People were going to work, carrying coffee, moving through their ordinary morning with the ordinary resolve of people who had somewhere to go. She looked at them for a long time. She thought about the notification on her wall on the ship, which was now docked and would be upgraded and retrofitted and would eventually take someone else somewhere else. She thought about the 7 coordinates in the navigation maps of every ship in the galaxy, lying there under their old names. Empty, not a monument. No one called them that. No one gave speeches. There was no ceremony. There was no established day of remembrance. No formal structure around what they were. They just were 7 places that told the truth about what happened in the only language that couldn't be revised, the language of what you could see with your own eyes and couldn't dispute, and couldn't store under a softer category. She hadn't decided they would remain empty. That was the Commission's decision, but she understood why. They left them because they were honest. Because honesty, in the end, was the only thing that held. Everything else, speeches, ceremonies, documents with their careful language could be rewritten, could be rephrased, could be made to mean something slightly different by a different government in a different decade. But a bare coordinate on a navigation map, a world that had been named and present and was now empty that just spoke, it happened. She turned away from the window, put the glass in the sink, put the kettle on. She sat at the kitchen table and held the cup with both hands and let the warmth penetrate her palms and breathed. Outside, the city was fully awake. Somewhere, 7 coordinates sat silently on their maps. Somewhere, Vitari was arriving at the first of them with a cartography kit and a data tablet and the specific discipline of a person who had decided that looking clearly was the only thing he could do. Somewhere, 847 names sat in the first appendix of a document that would be stored in archives on 3 different worlds and would be read years later by people who hadn't been born yet. Somewhere, the name of a 19-year-old kid was last on the list. She drank her tea. The morning had come through the window, as always. It hadn't asked her if she had done the right thing. She was grateful for that. She would continue asking herself. That was what she had decided. It was the only honest way to carry it.